for your research, you spent a lot of time in Tijuana, and you talk about like both the public health crisis and also the immigration, breakdown at the border. You talk to, I believe, a lot of homeless people, people who are addicts, also migrants. Now, thanks to a lot of these denying people asylum, there are just people waiting on the Mexico side and on the Guatemalan side, but on the Mexico side of the border. Just what is it like there? What is this like forgotten land?
Right. Yeah. So, I think what I have tried to do in my research is really look at what's happening to two different communities of people at the border that have arrived at the border in very different ways, but are both kind of stuck there, right? So on the one hand, asylum seekers, right, who are often coming from either the interior of Mexico or elsewhere in the world, right, who, because of all these policies that the Trump administration has implemented and then now the Biden administration has implemented, are basically stuck in these border cities for months, if not years, right? And then on the other hand, I spent a lot of time, as you said, with homeless folks, many of whom were folks who have been deported actually from the US. So these are Mexican nationals who were deported from the United States back to border cities. Oftentimes, Tijuana receives the highest percentage of deportees from the United States and the entire hemisphere, actually.
Really? Okay.
So people often think of Tijuana as like the deportee capital of the Americas, right? And so it was a really heavy and fascinating place to spend some time, especially these last few years where we've had these kinds of different flows of communities arriving, and then, of course, totally experiencing different realities, but then both sort of essentially, this is where I talk about this, very academic idea of the carceral frontier, right? Where they're imprisoned at the border, where the border itself has sort of become a prison landscape for them. And so for deportees, the issue there is that these are folks, again, like I said, who are Mexican, but in many cases have spent most of their lives in the United States, are folks who have often gone through the criminal justice system of the United States, and then return as deportees with a tremendous amount of stigma, right? And oftentimes
return to Mexico with the stigma of having been deported and also having not lived in this country for decades.
Exactly.
Don't know the culture. Some don't even know the language.
Exactly. And then end up homeless, right? Because they don't have familial networks oftentimes at the places they're deported to. And then what happens? They're actually being often kind of targeted by the police because they're easy.
Crime rate goes up.
Yeah, well, and then of course, folks, it's easy and desirable to use drugs in that context, I would say.
Of course.
And so folks are then targeted by police very frequently and are, they're easy victims of policing in Tijuana and other border cities. And so, those are sort of some of the dynamics that I look at. And I think, a thread that sort of runs through a lot of this, I realized later was the ways in which kind of the war on drug policies really intersect with immigration in a lot of ways that we don't always think about. So, a lot of the asylum seekers that are fleeing countries is because they're fleeing, kind of drug war situations, right? Whether that's, you're talking about Honduras or then, in the interior of Mexico, these are folks who are fleeing kind of cartel violence in many cases, right? And with deportees, in many cases, folks are being deported still in very large numbers for drug-related, kind of crimes, right? Or for just possessing even drugs, right? And then, border cities being what they are, places for trafficking drugs, there's a wide abundance of drugs available. And so, like I said, it sort of becomes something that an easy way to escape the realities that you've been placed in. And
zooming out to the policy stuff, before I let you go, or I have two more questions, but one of them is this is such a Gordian knot. I want to use that phrase because of drug policies, in U.S. foreign policy, and then and border policies you're talking about. And we've talked about, Yohan Grillo, who writes all about narco violence, and his last book, I think he's got a new book out, but was about the Iron River, he calls it, of guns flowing not just legally through the plans that you talked about, but illicitly from, I mean, I don't know, Mateen, if you've been on the border, but there are so many gun stores and people buy guns and then bring them down, you know, into Mexico, and they flow again, this Iron River flow, and that fuels a lot of that narco violence too. But I guess with everything so like intertwined, what's the loosest piece for you? Is it funding more immigration courts? Is it changing immigration policy? Is it easing, you know, the drug war? Is it legalizing certain substances that would drastically, like, where do you see like the next piece loosening, if it could?
All the above, can I say?
Yeah, I must say, can I have all of the above?
Just throwing it at the wall, you know?
Yeah. All those sound great. You know, Franny Fio for president, please. No, I mean, really, we do have to work at, you know, all those levels, right? Because as you said, this is a knot, right? That's being caused by an array of punitive policies, right? Of policies that are out to punish people, that are not, you know, set up for humans, right? In the complexity of human lives. And so, you know, the war on drugs, I think, has been one of the most disastrous kind of set of policies, again, not just for the United States.
Drugs is undefeated.
Right. And for the entire region, exactly. Drugs have won.
They're still strong. They're winning.
Time. Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Funny how that happened.
And so, you know, we've the war on drugs has always been about approaching this through, you know, kind of what we, you know, talk about as the supply side, right? Sort of trying to reduce the supply, the production, the trafficking of drugs. And that has obviously been a complete and total failure, and will continue to be whenever there is, you know, a market, a demand for drugs. There will continue to be drugs flowing, right? I mean, that's just the reality that we have to contend.
And the U.S. government is responsible for bringing them in. I mean,
exactly. Well, absolutely, and that's been a part of the history as well up till now, right? Is the U.S.'s own role in all of this, and so, you know, I think the war on drugs has really been much more about U.S. hegemony in the region. It hasn't been about actually trying to stop the flow of drugs, and I think that's becoming clear now for a lot of people, right? It's about U.S. power. It's about it's about selling more guns. It's about right
selling military training and just sort of making sure these countries are under our thumb militaristically.
Fear mongering.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, it's, you know, I think of it as like drug war imperialism, right? And we hear, you know, Don Paley talks about drug war capitalism. I think this, you know, there's also this drug war imperialism thing happening as well.
Right. That's so ineffective and so clearly led to the amount of blowback, like the creation of gangs, like we just sort of spiral out and it gets worse and worse. And the drug war just becomes, it's like Republican candidates. They become sort of even just more cartoonish and more ridiculous versions of themselves. I feel like that's what happens on the border, to the point where you have, like, you know, Greg Abbott rolling out, you know, buoys with razor wire on them. You know, it's just like we are literal cartoons at this point. Like this, just a fucking Wile E. Coyote Looney Tunes type shit.
Right. Whereas people like him, you know, have made it very difficult to do any kind of real work around addressing issues of substance use and addiction and overdose, right? Like, you know, where Narcan is still very difficult to access in many places, you know, it's a medication that can reverse opioid overdose, right? Or, you know, fentanyl testing strips, right? Like giving people the chance to actually test their drug to see if it has fentanyl in it, because kind of one of the biggest ways in which overdose is happening right now is because people are using, you know, some drug like crystal, like, you know, like methamphetamines or, you know, or cocaine, and don't realize that there's fentanyl in it, right? Yeah. So there's some very simple, like, imagine, like, we spent, you know, billions of dollars on kind of this militaristic approach to the war on drugs, and just imagine if like 1 billion of that was actually spent, right, in kind of in this way, right? We could really make a lot more headway,
keeping people alive. Well, I mean, it's an interesting, I think that focusing on that, like the user side, but not from a criminal, like not from criminalizing it or decriminalizing it, because it creates, politically, it's such a toxic fucking cesspool that, like, all the homeowner, even libs, get so upset about, you know. And you've got, you know, articles about Portland that I was bitching about weeks ago, you know, about how the decriminalization has failed, like, even though it's been inactive for like 6 months, you know, less, whatever, like no time. But you're right that, like, really focusing, that's why I'm just like, the resistance from even supposedly liberal governors like Gavin Newsom to safe injection sites, the you know, criminal, like that same thing in New York. These are blue states. It's like, no, man, if you guys can't get on board with something so basic testing strips, the safe injections, needle exchange, whatnot, like any kind of harm reduction, like we're so fucked on, you know,
and expanding access to voluntary treatment as well, right? Like giving people that whole piece is like, it's so difficult to access treatment where people aren't forced to just go off of drugs immediately, right? Like that isn't abstinence based, right? I mean, so, you know, there's just so much work to be done. I mean, you know, when people think about harm reduction, you know, it's like we have to forget that, like, the type of harm reduction that is allowed to be done in the United States is like the most minimal form of it, right? Like there's a whole array of sort of harm reduction strategies that we aren't even allowed to do, right? Like you said, safe consumption sites, but also safe drug supply, actually, right? Which I know sounds crazy to people, but like, yes, if people are going to do meth, like let's give them some prescription, like methamphetamine, right? To know that they're like getting exactly, you know, the kind of dose quantity that is going to prevent them from overdosing, right? And then let's provide services. Yeah.
Right. But on that, and this is why I think this country, I mean, let's just like, I'm just so close to calling it quits, is that if the market's not involved, this country is allergic to a solution. So you can legalize marijuana as long as people can make money off of it.
Money.
And exactly.
How much money you need.
Right. And to circle back to our negotiations around like the legalized, the line is so blurry between, I mean, fentanyl is legal in a hospital setting. Like these big pharma companies freak the fuck out when they want price controls. They're just narcos with white collars. I said it.
It is. Absolutely.
They are narcos.
But no, but for real. And it's like, because what you just described would require a price negotiation and control of these substances. And oh no, we can't do that, because if the market's not involved, even if this market is killing people, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I mean, even getting those, like, what is it, 12 like drugs negotiated,
10,
like or whatever it is. I mean, it's just like, you know, why can't we do that with all drug prices in this country, right? You know, I mean, so I mean, absolutely.
No, but I do think, you know, as I studied when Uruguay legalized marijuana, and they did something that we will never do in this country, but had basically like government-run marijuana fields, and you could go, you have your little card, you buy affordable weed from the government, and they limit how much you can get. You can also grow it yourself. But again, it was this whole like, can you imagine? I mean, ironically, for all the Republicans that have now invested in marijuana, hello, John Boehner, remember that a-hole? Like, they would freak out if there was like Biden-run marijuana farms.
Right, exactly.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.